name is Matt Wood. I'm the policy director here at Free Press. One of the reasons I'm here is I used to work on these communications issues for the wrong side, really. I was a lawyer in law firms for about 8 years. So I worked for cable companies, and now my job is to attack them. So that's kind of a fun change to make. And I think it's so important that we not let companies be the only ones who dictate what lawmakers hear, what folks at the FCC hear on these very crucial issues. So that's me. I'm going to ask Dana to say hi.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dana Floberg. I'm a policy manager here at Free Press. And the reason that I work and want to work so much on these kinds of media and tech issues is they really feel like the gateway to all of the other issues that we care about. That's how we connect and organize for all of the other rights that we need to protect in this political moment and in every political moment. That's how we organize for racial justice. That's how we organize for all the things that we care about. And all of those fights get a lot harder if we can't reach out and connect over digital tools, over broadcast media, if we can't protect our own private data in those spaces. So that's something that is really, really important and really powerful and motivational to me.
Hey, so I'm Gaurav Laroya, counsel here at Free Press. One of the reasons I've really enjoyed doing this work and find it so interesting is the companies that we tend to go head-to-head with, the major telcos, the cell carriers, AT&T, Verizon, and now we're thinking more and more about the platforms like Google and Facebook, is that these are truly the gatekeepers, like Dana said, to the rest of society. And when they misbehave, which they tend to do, the ripple effects from those kinds of actions spread across society. On Facebook, for example, when if people can't organize or they're discriminated against in hiring decisions on the platform, they're not seeing ads, that makes a difference in people's lives. When people can't connect to a free and open internet through the cable or cellular companies, that makes a material difference in people's lives. So making sure that these systems are fair and, in the case of the telcos, are neutral and provide access to a free open internet, that stuff really matters, and it's exciting and interesting to be a part of working on these issues.
Yeah, so that's, a lot of great folks here, and that's why we're here, I think, for a lot of different reasons, but for the same goal, which is to help people speak up and take back their rights to speak to each other and to speak to power and to tell lawmakers what they really want to see done in Washington, not just business as usual, but a better way and a more just and equitable media system in the near term and hopefully in the longer term too. So you can take action on all this by clicking the link in the Facebook page that you're probably watching this on. You might be watching it on Zoom too, but in Facebook you can click the link there and take action to, as I said, speak out and really join the movement and join people who are talking to members of Congress, talking to the FCC a lot too, and letting folks know what they think needs to be done to make that media system work better for real people. So one of the things that, we sort of talked about some of this in the intro, but a lot of things happening in the tech space. I don't know if we even need to go over current events. It's like stuff happens like this all the time. But we have seen lots of victories in 2017 and 2018, but frankly, a lot of challenges too. I'll say it, a terrible presidential administration and one that's basically doing everything they can to take things away from people who are just under attack constantly. But on the technology and media side, we've seen this administration take away net neutrality, even though millions of people spoke out to try to keep it. We've seen them threaten people's right to even have access to the internet with programs the FCC has in place, one called Lifeline that we'll talk about a bit more, and taking it away from people and really trying to rip phones out of people's hands, quite literally in some cases, when that's the last thing we can afford. We've seen all kinds of mergers and proposals to make things better by letting these giant companies get together and trust us, then it'll all work out. We tend not to believe that. So, between that and the almost daily scandals we see, as Gaurav was talking about with Facebook and Google and the abuses of people's private data and who knows where they're sending it, and the kind of tracking, just a few weeks ago, a story broke that literal bounty hunters, yes, bounty hunters are getting information directly from cell phone companies. It's not just about Facebook and Google, but of course those guys are so huge and know so much about us. So all kinds of problems there. And I don't know if you all think, anything in particular unites those, or what exactly Congress has to do to push back against that. We think there are lots of different options, which is why we have this policy priorities document that covers a lot of ground. And there's no single answer if you ask us, but there are lots of hopefully good and bold ideas we can put forward to try and address some of those questions.
So to get into some of those bold ideas, there's a lot of, as you're saying, a lot of things that we've seen, a lot of threats to the open internet, to internet access. What are some of the things now that we are in this new year, this new moment with a lot of new members of Congress who seem to be really engaged and excited about trying to listen to real people, to engage with these kinds of issues? What are some of the ways that we can ask them to start fighting back?
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned net neutrality. I think a lot of people that follow Free Press think of us in that mode and think of us as associated with that important issue. It's not the only thing that we do, and it's certainly not the only thing that matters for the internet. We need to talk about people's access and ability to get online in the first place. But net neutrality, once you're there, if you're there, is basically your right to see and say what you want on the internet without the cable or the phone company dictating that to you, trying to take away your ability to see different sites or to speak out. And it's a fight that's been going on for well over a decade now, getting on 2 decades in DC, back and forth in the courts, some congressional action on it. We have lots of things we're trying to do to save it and bring it back after the FCC took it away at the end of 2017. And, you know, it's big news because just actually this week, tomorrow, I can almost keep track of what day it is this week, we'll be in federal court to sue the FCC and to have the argument in front of 3 judges at the DC circuit in a federal appellate court saying the FCC taking net neutrality away was exactly wrong. It was a wrong idea on the policy, but it was also wrong on the legal grounds that we're challenging. And that's something that's not out of our hands, but it's also not something that people can really speak up and do a lot about. You go in front of 3 judges and it's a closed process and usually a good process, but you can't always guarantee the results.
Yeah.
So what we're doing there is we're not just going to court and suing the FCC over their bad decision, but we are also trying to get people to rally around other ways to restore those rights. And one of the key ways is with a bill that we hope to see soon. We haven't seen it yet, but we had all kinds of energy last year in Congress to essentially just flip a switch and say the FCC's repeal order is no good, throw it out, bring back the rules that were adopted in 2015 that were strong and sound and working not just for internet users, but for the companies who make their living on the internet. And so we hope to see some kind of bill soon in this Congress where we can really rally everybody around it. It tends to be a partisan issue in DC, which is a strange town in a lot of ways, and this is one of them. Nobody really loves their cable company. Sorry, cable companies. But in DC, you do have this partisan divide where Democrats have traditionally supported net neutrality and Republicans have traditionally opposed it, at least in any meaningful form. So that's the kind of fight that's shaping up in the new Congress is we're going to court to try to get net neutrality back. But we're not just waiting for that court decision. We're also trying to move on the popular and the legislative front and getting members of Congress to understand the importance of not just net neutrality, but the legal framework for the FCC to do lots of things, to have an eye out for real people when they're trying to get online and the cable or phone company might be trying to get in the way just to make more money for themselves. And so that's one of the main things that I think we'll see moving soon, but it's obviously not the only thing we're watching in this Congress. It just tends to be a focal point because of the history there and because of the attention that the issue has gotten.
One of the other things that we're asking for new members of Congress and all members of Congress to do is to pay more attention to programs like the Lifeline program at the FCC that Matt mentioned earlier. The Lifeline program specifically is a way that the FCC gives money to carriers to subsidize telecommunications access for low-income people. It is a $9.25 subsidy, higher in tribal areas, and recently the FCC, before this particular administration, had expanded the program so that it could also apply to internet access, so that folks who want to get online, who want to cross the digital divide but can't afford to, and we know that that's the primary reason that most folks who aren't connected to the internet, who don't have at-home internet access, the primary reason that that is because that's too expensive and they can't afford it. So the Lifeline program specifically is designed to help those folks connect. But right now, what we've seen from this FCC in this administration is just a constant barrage of attacks against this program, trying to kick out the resellers who are big participants in this program in ways that would leave nearly 70% of Lifeline users without their current carrier. That would be really harmful for communities in areas that have been devastated by natural disasters like Puerto Rico. Truly just taking cell phones and internet connections away from folks who need it most, who are relying on those connections. So what we're really looking for is for people in Congress to stand up to say, that's not okay. This is a good program. This is a program we need to protect. We need to be helping people connect to the internet, which can be a literal lifeline for so many folks. So that's also something that we are looking for, because that kind of internet access we know is really huge and is really, really difficult a lot of times for folks to get affordably, especially if they are low income or people of color.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what we see so often, and something that you've done a lot of research on and we looked at, is Lifeline is important. It's not the only thing we need to worry about. Yeah. Broadband is not super affordable for anybody, but for the folks at the very bottom end of the income scale, it is the only way they can get online a lot of the time.
Right.
What we tend to hear in Congress, though, and from a lot of cynical folks, is you can't have both. You can't have both open access, like non-discriminatory access to the internet, and have it be cheap enough. And I think it's a really cynical and condescending argument where it's this false choice of like, well, you know, poor people can probably do with a worse internet.
Yeah.
Like, no, we reject that kind of thinking, but
Absolutely.
There's lots of stuff that we need to do to make that real, to get people actually connected and free to go where they want once they're there. Speaking of keeping people connected and fighting mergers, which I think I mentioned earlier, we're fighting a big one right now, and the T-Mobile Sprint merger has been sold by some people, at least by the lobbyists for those companies, as a way to make access cheaper and better. And we simply don't believe them, I think we have to say.
Yeah. So fortunately, we don't believe them because they've actually said that the merger will raise prices. But to table set a little bit, as Matt said, there's currently T-Mobile and Sprint are trying to merge. There's 4 national cellular carriers: T-Mobile, Sprint, Verizon, AT&T. T-Mobile and Sprint are the low-cost carriers. They tend to provide cheaper service, a little worse service than the premium carriers like AT&T and Verizon, but service that really helps people of color and people on low-income people get cell access and get mobile data access. So and this is actually their second bite at the apple of trying to merge. So in 2014, these two companies tried to merge. The FCC said no. These are two companies in the exact same market. It's what we'd call a classic horizontal merger, meaning that two companies doing the same thing, one's trying to eat the other one. So they went at it again in this administration. I think they thought they'd be able to get away with things that they couldn't last time, and I think hopefully that's not the case, but certainly they're trying. So the FCC is in the middle of its review of this merger that's going on right now. It's got about another 3 months to go. The FCC has an obligation to look at the public interest case for a merger of telecommunications, whether it's a license transfer. And so they have a heightened requirement to see if it enhances, if a merger of this kind would enhance competition, accelerate deployment of services, and, importantly, ensure diversity of services to the public that are affordable. And we've run the numbers, as like I said, and T-Mobile has admitted, this merger is going to raise prices on people. If you look at just who ends up getting service from T-Mobile and Sprint, these two companies have a disproportionate amount of customers that are people of color and people on low income. Just a couple numbers really quickly. 56% of T-Mobile's customers are people of color. 45% of Sprint's. For their prepaid brands, that means those are brands that you pay at the beginning of the month. They don't require credit checks. They're often a lot cheaper, and they help more people get access to these services. The numbers of people of color and on low incomes on those services are even higher. Upwards of 60% on Metro PCS, which is owned by T-Mobile, 57% on Boost, which is owned by Sprint. And this is really important. When it comes to really low income people making less than $25K a year, it's 30% of Metro PCS's customers and around 30% of Boost customers make less than $25K a year. And so what we're really worried about is, as T-Mobile has admitted, we're looking at something like a 15% increase in prices on those services. And so that means, are people that are low income, or even people that are in a position where they have to make really tough choices about whether they're going to pay for their cell phone bill this month, for their data plan this month, versus other like life's necessities. Are they going to be able to absorb that cost? We don't think so, and it's not a choice that people should be forced into making when we're better off in a market with 4 competitors that are all competing against each other. The lower T-Mobile and Sprint, making sure prices stay low, but they also compete up in the higher end of the market and make sure that AT&T and Verizon can't just print money off of their incredibly rich customers. Not that they're not doing that already, but it would, the situation would be markedly worse. And frankly, Matt's laugh is right. That's why T-Mobile wants to suck up Sprint. They want to be able to play the same game that the other big companies are making. Just sit back, print money, get it from people that can afford higher levels of access, that can pay $100 a month for service, and not worry about the segment of the market that they were forced to compete in alongside Sprint. So we really think this is going to, worsen the digital divide, kick people off service, and we're out there fighting to stop it. We're encouraging people to ask their members of Congress to talk about the problems with this merger, to tell members of Congress to get in front of the regulators and say, have you really looked at this deal, make sure, one, why it was rejected in 2014, and two, really look at the impacts that it's going to have on people who are the most vulnerable when it comes to access to the internet.
Yeah, it's amazing. They still get a license to print money, but they want to print even more of it. No surprise. And it's really funny to see what they'll resort to get that. Funny, tragic, but comical in some ways too. Like there was a story just 2 weeks ago that the CEO of T-Mobile, who used to fight with President Trump, then Donald Trump, is suddenly staying at his hotel in D.C. And it's like, gee, I wonder why. What do they think they could possibly get out of kissing up to the president?
It was a whole suite of executives. It
wasn't just them, right?
Yeah, it was very blatant, and that's the kind of dealing that we're trying to fight against in this administration, and make sure that the entire regulatory regime around neutrality isn't killed for these kinds of for helping the companies just print money.
Maybe just another minute on this, because it hasn't gotten a ton of attention up until recently. It started to get, I think, a little hotter thanks to stories like that about the Trump Hotel. It's amazing to see the different stories they'll tell, and one of them is the prices will go down. They've admitted prices will go up. They just have a very different story they tell to their investors when they're trying to tell them how good this deal will be for the company, rather than for their users. And one of the things they talk about that I don't think we even need to spend too much time on, but it's just this typical, like I said, false argument. You can have one but not the other. They say you only get faster speeds, we'll only get to this next generation of wireless networks, 5G, if you let us get together. And again, they've contradicted themselves there, right?
Yeah.
They said that's not true before they proposed the deal.
Yeah. So what's amazing is that when these companies go ahead, talk to their investors, they have to tell the truth. And unfortunately, it's a little fuzzier with what they tell members of Congress, the public, and other people. So even before they announced this deal, both T-Mobile and Sprint are out there making the case to their investors that they're going to deploy this next generation network, that both companies have the technology, have the resources inside their own companies to be able to deploy this network, get nationwide coverage of the next generation of wireless technology. But all of a sudden, the deal was announced, and now these two companies just can't do it without each other. And the thing is, as we said, they've admitted it, and in a forum in which they have to be truthful, that they can independently bring their companies to the next generation of technology. But all of a sudden, once they wanted to close this deal, they're talking to your representatives and saying that, oh no, they can't possibly do it without the combined resources of this company, of this newly merged T-Mobile Sprint. And we know that's flatly not true. One small, like you said, small anecdote about that. These are the same kinds of lies, frankly, that these companies have been saying anytime they want to merge together.
Yeah.
In 2011, AT&T tried to buy T-Mobile, saying that they couldn't possibly deploy 3G, 4G without being a combined company, that T-Mobile was flailing, it wouldn't be able to compete in the market. And guess what? Regulators rightly at the time said, no, you need to be separate companies, compete with each other. And to T-Mobile's credit, they were forced to compete in the market. became a maverick competitor, went after customers that were previously not online or couldn't afford cell access, became this, maverick company that was, pushing the envelope on lowering of prices for people and was able to deploy all the right technology. So, we are skeptical on the merits about the claims that they're making, but also history is repeating and we've seen this before. And so I think, the credulousness by which people take these claims is not warranted.
I would never say our job is easy, but so much of it is, well, if you listen to what they say over here and compare it to what they say the next day, you see that they're not telling the truth. And, before we talk a little bit more about privacy in the online space, I think mergers in the broadcast space too is the same exact pattern.
Yeah.
The broadcasters come out and they say, we need to get together or else journalism will die, broadcasting will die. And journalism is in dire straits in some cases, but as Dana knows so well, we don't take their arguments at face value that only by consolidating, only by cutting out news operations and cutting down the number of journalists can they continue to survive and provide this kind of information. And we had a big victory last year, but the job is never done because they're back again with a newly proposed tie-up.
Yeah, so one of the other things that I think a lot of folks are thinking about and a lot of folks are writing about right now too is how we restore public trust in news and public trust in journalism at a moment where that is really shaken. And a lot of times we see big broadcast conglomerates, Sinclair's a personal favorite of mine, coming to the FCC, coming to regulators and saying, the only way to do this is if you let us merge. But all of the data that we've seen, the history has shown that, in fact, that kind of media consolidation is bad for news. It's bad for journalism. We had the merger that Matt is referring to and the victory that we had. A lot of folks might remember just last year when Sinclair Broadcasting tried to buy up Tribune, which would have made them far and away the largest broadcaster in the country, reaching into so many homes. Many of you may also have seen a video showing one of Sinclair's least savory practices, where they force all of their local anchors to read propaganda created by Sinclair as a corporate entity, where they send that out and try to use the faith and trust that you have in your local journalists and local anchors to sell their corporate agenda. So Sinclair has always been a really bad actor in this space when it comes down to supporting local news. They're often, anytime they've bought up new companies, the first thing they do is go through, fire journalists across the board, start merging newsrooms so that suddenly, instead of having 2 or 3 different competing newsrooms trying to get you local stories and share what's going on in your communities, you have one merged newsroom with half the journalists trying to do 3 times the work. So, and that's something we've seen. We've seen Sinclair do that. We've seen all of these different broadcast companies do that. And we were able to stop that merger, and that was an incredible victory. But absolutely, the work is not done. Part of the reason that merger was even conceivable was because this FCC and FCCs in the past have been slowly chipping away at all of the regulatory protections that are supposed to stop broadcasters from getting so big. Regulations that are supposed to stop them from reaching too many homes across the country, that are supposed to stop them from controlling too many stations in the same market so that you actually can have competing viewpoints on local issues. And we've seen all of those rules being chipped away, and this FCC is still trying to do that. They're still sitting there thinking about raising the national ownership cap so that these big broadcasters can get even bigger. They're chipping away at all of the different protections so that slowly you can have one company buying up all of your local stations, your local newspaper, your local radio station, so that you could become your town could become a one newsroom town effectively. So one of the things that we're really looking for here is, we've been defending those rules for a long time. It's been a hard-fought battle in the trenches, in the courts, in wherever we can fight them to protect those last scraps of rules that we have. But we're really looking to move the ball forward. This isn't just about protecting the last shreds of regulatory power that we have. We're trying to move the ball. How about no broadcaster can own more than one television station in a market? How about we cut the national ownership limit in half? How about we start making these big broadcasters get smaller so they have to pay attention to their local communities, so they have to sell stations so that we might actually get new actors in the space, new viewpoints being shared. That kind of change is something that Congress could absolutely do, and is something that could start to make our traditional media system, which is still so important even in the online space. So much of current reporting, even if you're reading it online, so often it's come from local traditional reporters at television stations and newspapers. We need to make sure that that ecosystem is thriving. And right now, with all of these big conglomerates buying each other up, it's not. That's a problem that's getting worse. And we need some really bold action at the congressional level to start writing the rules that we need and actually making these big companies get smaller and more accountable to communities.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And again, click the link in the Facebook page to take action and find out how you can talk to your member of Congress about these crucial issues. So glad you're focused on what we can do to actually start pushing the boulder back in the right direction and not just accepting the status quo of like, well, what are you going to do if these companies get together? I just can't resist, though, going back again to our job being pointing out when these companies lie. And even this FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, he of the bad memes and the questionable associations, when he's caught, dancing with ridiculous right-wing, alt-right racists trying to sell his policies with a happy face. Like, very disgusting guy, if you ask me. Sorry. But even he, when he was told Sinclair wants to buy these stations and they promised to do the right thing, like the FCC rejected that deal because Sinclair was basically lying right to the FCC's face.
Sinclair, I mean, a lot of these broadcasters, they do have a history of trying to fudge things at the FCC, coming up with these shady sharing agreements where they can effectively take control of a station but claim that they don't own it when they're talking to the FCC. So if the FCC says you can only own one station in this market, they're like, we only own one. We just control all of the programming and marketing for this other station. Please don't look too closely. Despite the fact that they do tell the SEC and their investors, like, of course we own this station. We make a lot of money from this station.
We love owning stations.
We love not owning all of these stations that we definitely don't own. And this is something that the FCC has been complicit in. This FCC has been very complicit in greenlighting these deals, in looking the other way and pretending that this isn't the obvious loophole that it is. But yeah, Sinclair went so far, they leaned so far into their lie and made it actually ridiculous enough that even Ajit Pai felt that he couldn't pretend anymore. As much as we know he wanted to, he couldn't pretend that this was even remotely compliant with the minimal rules that are left. Sinclair could not even just get its act together enough to pretend to comply. And that really was part of how that deal fell apart.
And what'd you say? Sinclair has so many unsavory practices on their menu, but the least savory practice is pushing propaganda out to their local news anchors. Now we have a new player. So the deal on the table now, at least now that the government's open again and they can file their paperwork, is a company called Nexstar. Wants to buy those same Tribune stations. So we'll have a lot of the same fights all over again.
Yeah, Nexstar, who, if you look up Nexstar on Glassdoor, most of the comments there refer to it as Death Star. So not a particularly delightful alternative.
AT&T is going to sue them for trademark.
I know.
So that will be coming up, and we'll probably be opposing that deal. And as you said, we're also in court trying to preserve the rules that we have at the FCC. So in court on net neutrality tomorrow, and in court talk about media ownership rules sometime soon, later this spring, as the paperwork's already going there. But another big part of loss of trust in journalism and what we're seeing, and can we even believe our own eyes when it comes to the news that we're seeing, are the things people are seeing online, of course. And we've historically worked a little less on the edge companies, as they're sometimes called. We focus more on the network. It's not because these edge companies like Google and Facebook and a few others in that small club, Amazon in different ways, don't have a ton of power. So we're definitely starting to think about, and beyond starting to think about, starting to take action on what we can do to rein in that power. Privacy is not the only thing in that space, and we talked about it a bit earlier, but privacy is among the biggest issues. And even privacy is not necessarily the right way to think about it, right? I think you talked, Barb, about the harms to people, not just from their data being taken, but then being used against them.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the way we think about it is that, right, privacy rights are civil rights, right? I think it's incontrovertible at this point that algorithms can have like blatantly discriminatory impacts to people, right? So that means the way your information that you willingly give up to a website or use on a platform, whether it's Facebook, Google, or whatever in the panoply of services that are available online, gets repackaged, sold to advertisers, and then kind of, frankly, sometimes like weaponized against the people who end up using these services. So, right, that means, things like how hiring decisions are made, or even like ads for hiring, right? Companies, there was a study recently, companies that were advertising jobs above 250K were really only showing them to men. I mean, because they can make those inferences from when and how you're browsing, whether you're a man or not, and decide not to show you an ad for a high-paying job if you're a woman, right? So there's other things, right? There was a scandal recently on Facebook where you were able to exclude housing advertisements for people that had an African-American affinity. So they had to stop it because this was discovered. But these kinds of examples are legion. This is a kind of a core way the ad economy online is using the information that we use just to kind of perpetuate, let's say, the 20th centuries and older's worst stereotypes into the 21st century inside black boxes held by these companies that until now it's been really hard to see how they function. So right, that's, as you said, that's one of the reasons we're so interested in unpacking how privacy is being discussed on Capitol Hill, in public, because it's not just, oh, I want to see the terms I click to for this website, and there's a thing I'm not going to read, and then X company can do whatever they want with that information. I mean, it's kind of like what you said with bounty hunters. The telcos, it turns out, when you sign up for a mobile service, are still doing it, selling your location information.
They promised to stop real soon, though.
Yeah, they promised to stop really soon. Yeah, so then they sold it to, apparently they said, all their customers agreed to this. They sold it to a third party, who sold it to another party, who then, as Matt said, because it's kind of unbelievable, sold it to literal bounty hunters. And a story came out saying that, for, what was it, $300? Yeah, $300, you could find the location of basically any cell phone in the country if you had their number. So, like, right, the edge companies are a problem, but the telcos have been fighting rules that protect the use of their information for years at this point. And they, unfortunately, were successful in getting rid of some late Obama administration's rules that would have protected people from those kinds of abuses from their cell provider and other telecommunication services. They fought those rules, got them wiped away in Congress, and now a lot of the same companies are going up to Capitol Hill and asking for, the weakest kinds of privacy rules that they can muster. Things like, if we write it down what we're going to do with your information, and you agree to it, that's good enough for us. And then what we do with it after that, it doesn't, that's none of your concern. And so, going back to privacy being part of civil rights, we think that's not good enough. There are certain uses of that information, like selling to bounty hunters, or like denying people economic opportunities, denying them full participation in our democracy, that really need to be put a stop to. And that goes beyond just allowing these companies to be able to use the information that we, have to give them, frankly, to be able to use the internet, to be able to get on our cell phones against us. So, I think we're on the Hill. We're asking members of Congress to take the threats to our, economic livelihoods, our safety as well, seriously when it comes to how these companies want to use that kind of information against us.
Yeah, thank you. Can you talk a little more too? I mean, there's all this energy on Capitol Hill right now, or at least what passes for energy in Washington. A lot of it's been focused on the House. You have these amazing new members. Yeah. Nobody needs to even have me say their names because they know who they are already. They're stars. Yeah. And a renewed speakership for Nancy Pelosi. But a lot of the privacy legislative action has been on the Senate side, funnily enough. There might be some hope of bipartisanship there. Yeah. But it's like, without getting into picking favorites, a among all of our senatorial friends. It seems like there's a let a thousand flowers bloom kind of attitude right now, and maybe that works out, or maybe that needs to be harnessed sometime soon.
Certainly, both I guess flowers and weeds are blooming. Marco Rubio had a bill that would wipe away all other privacy protections, I believe, other than whatever his bill says. So, right, there are good proposals on the Senate side. There are bad proposals on the Senate side, and I think we've been able to go to the Hill, weed through what those proposals look like. Fortunately, people are taking data security and privacy seriously. I think there is a move out there to empower an agency, whether it's the Federal Trade Commission, restore some rights back to the FCC when it comes to protecting telecommunications customers, empowering an agency to make sure that they can issue rules that prevent all of these serious harms that we're talking about. The best of those bills also seek to empower individuals to be able to take a company to court and say, these aren't, I have these rights, we've written them down, and be able to enforce them themselves and, go to Facebook and say, I didn't give you permission, or I couldn't reasonably have foreseen that you were going to hand my information off to a bounty hunter. That's not cool. Let's, talk about how to remedy that. And the problem is right now, if you agree to it in 100 pages of terms and conditions, basically that's as good, basically that'll fly. And, that situation is untenable.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to work more at the FCC. And as I said, we haven't historically done as much on the privacy side or the FTC side. But that's where we're heading because that's where a lot of the action is. And even though we've said about things like net neutrality in the past, no, we don't need a new approach. The laws that we had in place and that were thrown out by the IFCC were working. In privacy, I guess we would say there actually is room for new ideas, and not just room for them, but a dire need for them too in a lot of cases. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about the platforms and the interplay with journalism. This is sort of a messy topic in some ways because everybody knows from watching it how much of a role Facebook and Google play in dictating what people can see. We think they're different from the cable and phone companies in that sense. They have a lot of power, too much power, but there are actually multiple websites out there. So we call for net neutrality for the networks. We don't go into the call for things like platform neutrality that others might have talked about. So, it's a kind of a fine line to walk, but we think it's an important one to hold and to keep the difference between internet service providers on one hand and websites on the other. But that is not to deny that the websites have outsized influence in the advertising market on our elections, of course. We were endorsers last year of the Honest Ads Act, which is a way to try to get more transparency into the system of political advertising. And then we're also talking about how to make sure that all of the benefits of this massive internet economy are not just captured by those who are printing even more money in Silicon Valley, like Mark Zuckerberg, who was here for a not so successful series of hearings last year. But Facebook has a lot to account for, and he didn't do a particularly good job of accounting for himself. But exactly what do we do about it? How do we maybe, as we said in our policy priorities document that we're talking about here today at this town hall, how do we get some of that money directed back towards quality, local, accountable, equitable journalism?
Yeah.
So we have some ideas on the table, but I don't know if you think there's anywhere to go with those now, besides putting the ideas out there and having others, hopefully those who are sitting on Capitol Hill, pay attention to not just the problem, which we can all see, but some of these hopeful solutions.
Well, let me just to add one thing about what Matt was saying about Facebook, and we're talking about companies that are making 40% profits over their operating costs. They are massively rich companies that tend to be violating people's rights and wreaking havoc, it seems, throughout the kind of media ecosystem in other ways. Just to note, right, so the Facebook had an agreement with the Federal Trade Commission in 2011 saying they'd stop violating people's privacy. After the 2016 election, we ended up finding out that they, misleadingly sold information about, I think, literally hundreds of millions of Americans to a company that then turned around and tried to manipulate the 2016 election. What is important is that in the agreement that they made with the FTC, if they violated people's privacy again after 2011, they're supposed to be subject to major fines. It's something like $40,000 per violation per day. So which, you know, we were hoping, and
Which they have.
Yeah, right, which they have. So seriously, they're sitting on a giant pile of money. So I think one of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that agencies that we want to work with also hold, you know, these companies accountable for one of the promises they've made to their customers and to the public at large. So, you know, a small piece of that is kind of making sure that agencies that we want to have work for the public live up to their promises and hold companies accountable when they say they should. And in this case, we're really hoping that they hold Facebook accountable for violating their customers' privacy and you know, not following through on a deal they made with the government to knock it off and not do that again.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, because DC sometimes by design is sort of impenetrable. The lawmakers don't want people to know everything they could do or should be doing. But, you know, I think it's broken through to some degree because of the excitement around this election. People have talked about oversight quite a bit. And that's why it's so important for you to contact your members of Congress. Not only are we going to go to them and say, pass a new law to do things better, which is vital, but hard to do even when you don't have a dysfunctional Congress and broken system like we seem to right now.
Yeah.
If they're not passing new laws, they can still do things. They can still tell the FCC what they're doing right and doing wrong. They can tell the FTC do better.
Yeah.
And, you know, Congress really sets the rules for these agencies, not just the laws that the agencies have to follow, but also their day-to-day operations and what they're spending their time on. So that's another great reason to talk to your member of Congress and say, hey, this is not okay. What are you going to do about it? It doesn't always have to be a new piece of legislation.
Right. Well, and I think it's also really important to note that having people speaking, having real people and constituents talking to the members of Congress makes the job in DC way, way easier. When we're going to the Hill and trying to get policymakers to care about these issues, to say, yeah, I need to get active about this. I need to do something. I need to show the people who elected me that I care about this issue, and specifically I should do this thing to help fix them, to help protect their privacy online, to help ensure that they actually have access to local media, to ensure that they can get online affordably and move around on the internet freely without their internet service providers getting in the way. To make members care about that, a lot of times what they need to do is they need to hear from people. That's what's going to motivate them. We're going to come at them with all of the legal arguments and all of the policy documents and all of that, and that's convincing to a point. But we are dealing with folks who are their job is to listen to you. And that's what's going to be compelling. That's going to make them read the policy documents that we're bringing there. And that kind of reinforcement inside and outside DC is so critical for actually getting movement on these things. And is part of how we can actually move some of these big, bold ideas forward. Now that we've got new policymakers too, who are listening to people in a way that feels very new, feels very fresh these days, that's a really critical piece of all of this.
Yeah, and it's also, we have an amazing field team at Free Press. We don't just call them, although they still love phone calls on Capitol Hill. The phone is not out of date on Capitol Hill because the sound of the phone ringing really gets their attention. But then we also go meet them in their districts back home. Where a lot of you live. Not everybody is lucky enough to live in DC like we all are. So that's really crucial too, to show up in person, to click that link, to send that email, to make that phone call, whatever you can do to help make the change that we need to have in our communication system. And you talked about how important it is and how it makes the job easier when they start listening and talking about it. You actually did all the research and wrote up a piece about how many of these new members of Congress were talking about these important issues. It didn't used to be an everyday or every election cycle occurrence, but they're talking about net neutrality. They're talking about broadband access and affordability. And that's crucial because it was not always so prominent in the conversation.
Yeah, we went through and looked at the newly elected officials, and at least 70% of new House Democrats all stated their support for net neutrality during their campaigns, which is phenomenal considering how many times that we've all been told that net neutrality is too wonky, real people don't care about it, and the fact is real people do. And you all made that so clear, filing comments at the FCC, calling your representatives. This has been a long fight, and even though right now we're on the downbeat, we're still trying to fight for those rules back. You've changed the conversation. We've all changed the conversation, and we're seeing members talk about it, and that's super exciting. That's so many new people that we can walk into, and they already know what side of the issue they need to be on, what side of the issue their constituents want them to be on, and that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and it's net neutrality. It's also digital divide. And a lot of the conversation around broadband is lack of access, and people very quickly run to rural and say, we got to build better broadband in the country. And that's true, we do. But we also have to pay attention to people in cities who can't afford it. And to be honest, frankly, where a lot of these newly Democratic members come from, they come from blue states, or they come from cities, or whatever term you want to throw at it. And so we have to listen to people and actually attend to real problems, not just the ones that are politically feasible or that seem popular, that make for good talking points. That you saw people talking not just about net neutrality, but about affordability, about access, about media and this crisis in journalism that we're seeing, and really top to bottom, getting the technology platform in there, not because technology is cool and important in its own right, but I think, as you both said so well, because it matters for everything else in people's lives now too. So yeah, click the link again, talk to your members of Congress, talk to your lawmakers, other places at the local and state level. We see action on net neutrality these days. We here in the DC policy shop are more focused on Washington, but that's not the only place where people can make change, obviously. And a lot of the stuff we've been talking about has been people versus corporations who are trying to take advantage of them to pad their bottom lines. Hard enough to fight. I don't want to open up a whole other can of worms here as we get close to the end of our hour, which flew by pretty quickly. Yeah. But we're also working, as we have for the last several years, on trying to reduce and eliminate unwarranted and, frankly, improperly targeted government surveillance and police action, where, mass surveillance, as revealed by Edward Snowden, is a problem for everybody, but we so often see the communities most often marginalized and attacked based on their race, based on their country of origin. Those are the people who are most often under surveillance by the surveillance state that we've allowed to creep up and stay in existence for too long. So that's coming up this year too. That's in our policy priorities. We want to make sure that people are safe when they're online and free to go where they want without fear of a company taking advantage of them or the federal government or their local police force taking advantage either. So Gaurav, that's a big issue for Congress to face in 2019 too.
Yeah. So I mean, as Matt said, what is particularly insidious is that, right, these technologies are essential to daily life, right? We need them to, apply for jobs, to communicate with each other. At the same time, the government, like as Matt said, whether it's police or like the federal intelligence agencies, use the same tools that we use to communicate with each other too often. Track people to your local police force may very well be, and we've seen this, monitor a city's worth of social media information. So the conversations people are having with each other, sometimes even behind private messages, and then use that information to disproportionately target Black and brown people, to go after low-level offenses, really to keep the carceral state full of people. And as I said, it's really insidious because, we want to encourage people to use these technologies to gain the benefit of being able to communicate and fully participate in the, kind of communicative society that we're building. And then to have the government turn around and use these tools against the very people often that need it to be able to communicate is pretty, it's a real big problem, and it kind of dilutes the freedom that we have to communicate with each other. The particular piece of legislation that's coming up this year that Matt spoke about it's called Section 215, and what that is, it's one of the revelations by Edward Snowden that the NSA had started collecting literally from the USA Patriot Act every single phone call in the United States and building kind of a chain of hops for phone calls out of that. So they would be able, if you called your pizza guy, they'd be able to track, that phone call for, every time someone else called that. They'd be able to just sit on that information, dig through it without having to get a warrant. So fortunately, after the Snowden revelations, that law was changed in 2015. It is better. The government is allowed to do a little bit less with that, but not nearly enough. So that law is coming up set to expire again at the end of the year, and we're fighting to get out of this kind of dystopian, always on alert for terrorism mind frame, while keeping people safe, and make sure that authority actually just ends, and then we can go back to a system that used to exist, where if the government wants information, they actually just have to go to a judge, ask for a warrant, and get it, instead of having to just be able to saddle up to AT&T and say, hand us over literally everything you've got, and have the company saying, yeah, sure, Uncle Sam. So that's not a system that is conducive, as you said, to liberty, and also, for people to fully enjoy being able to use these technologies in a way that makes them feel safe and secure.
Good on Uncle Sam. Yeah, and that's the thing too, as you said, it's not that there aren't other ways to get this information, but it has been basically records on every single call, not the content, probably, that's what we're saying, but just who we're talking to and mapping that out. So maybe as we start to close, I love that point that you made about the importance of these tools and yet the dangers and the problems with using them. And we talked about the digital divide earlier. Frankly, we can't do enough talking about it, if you ask me, because it is such an important problem. Free Press did landmark research a couple years ago about this persistent racial and ethnic, if we're using the census designations, component to the digital divide. And I don't know, Dana, if you want to talk about what that divide looks like nowadays, based on what Gara was saying too. It's not, we hear so often all these excuses, like people don't understand the internet, or they don't really feel like they need it, or they might be legitimately worried about privacy invasions, both from companies and from government. But so often they don't have a choice. They need the access. There are so many benefits from it, but they still can't get connected because they can't afford it. And I just wonder if you want to maybe tie all those together, because it's such an important nexus of issues for us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because two of the most powerful and serious parts of the digital divide, of the gap between those who have access to the internet and those that don't, are race and income. And they are two of the factors that we hear the least about from our policymakers who supposedly care about closing the digital divide. This research that we did found that not only is there a tremendous gap between the internet haves and have-nots based on your income. I believe only 49% of folks making $20K or less a year have access to the internet. And even when we control for income, even when we account for the fact that due to other systemic problems and racist history in this country, that people of color tend to make less than white people, even when we account for those differences and we control for income, there is still a racial adoption gap when it comes to broadband internet, where people of color do not have the same kind of access as white people in this country to the internet. So that says to us that a huge part of this divide is about the internet being too expensive for so many people, and that there's also systemic racial discrimination in the broadband market. And that's something that so often we're not talking about when we talk about the digital divide. We'd much rather talk about how we can give Comcast more money to build more places, when in fact they often already provide service to those places. They just don't want to offer that service at prices that anyone can afford. They don't want to offer that service without credit checks that are racist and have a racist history, and often make it even harder for people of color to connect and to get access to the internet. And this is a huge part of all of this, where we see the internet and all of these different tools, all of these tools to communicate, can be tools for liberation, and they can also be tools for oppression, depending on how we use them and how we structure our society, depending on the kinds of laws and rules and regulations that we make these policymakers pass. And to make sure that we can use the internet and the internet can be a tool of liberation, we absolutely need to address the digital divide so that everyone can get online equitably. And we need to make sure that when they're doing that, they're not also being targeted by law enforcement, outsized based on their race, based on their background, based on their history of activism. Those kinds of protections, we need that on both sides, where we can encourage people to get access, to make those choices, to connect, to communicate, and also eliminate these threats and these risks that are being posed by giant corporations, by law enforcement, by other government agencies that make it so hard for oftentimes the most marginalized folks in our communities to actually reap those benefits.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think we could end in a more important place. I mean, it is about getting people to connect and communicate with each other, but only when that's to their benefit and not just to some company's benefit and not just to the government's benefit, is trying to track people and map it out. On that digital divide point in our policy priorities document, which you can get to at freepress.net, if you want to go through the whole document, it's not that long, 4 pages, come on, give us some slack. We have some ideas for how to make broadband more affordable and to get over that systemic discrimination hurdle, or maybe I should say those multiple hurdles.
Yeah.
Not like there's any easy single solution to it, but we have a couple ideas about what the government can do in addition to keeping the Lifeline program that you talked about so well earlier.
Yeah, no, and one of the ones that I'm the most excited about is an idea to, since we know that so much of this divide is about affordability, it's about lack of affordability, it's about people who can't afford to pay for broadband, is to give people money to buy broadband so that they can connect. And yeah, to have a broadband affordability fund instead of dumping all of this money into exclusively into the carriers, into these companies, and saying, please build out to the places that, that we think still need it, and certainly charge them whatever you want. Let's actually give that money to people who are desperately trying to connect, who understand the value of broadband, and need help to support that. That's one of probably the fastest things we could do to start to address that affordability divide, and would be a really exciting and bold change that we could make.
Yeah, and that's what we're all about, is trying to make big changes, but not wait forever to do them, to make them now. And that's why we need you to contact your member of Congress, your local lawmakers, the FCC, make a lot of phone calls, tell people why this matters to you. And as Dana said, it makes our job a lot easier. We go to people with arguments, but we're really about being both inside of DC and outside of DC, and making sure those two things work together, political power and persuasion, with fine folks like these two. It's been a pleasure to spend the hour with you. We're there. We're when our crack digital team said, come and talk about your policy priorities, it's like, that's what we do. So we're so happy to be able to share some more of this with you, and happy to keep talking about it online and off. I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, which is a terrible question, but final words before we sign off and send people off to freepress.net and to the link to take action on the Facebook page too. Or is that the worst interview question in the world?
No, I think it can make it work. I mean, I think that the thing that really connects all of these for me is something that actually a colleague of ours says a lot, and really always sticks with me, is that really what we're shooting for here is for everyone to be able to tell their own story through media, whether that's through broadcast, through the internet, through any of these different ways that we connect with each other. And that's really what we're fighting for here, is that instead of seeing different representations that other people are telling us who we are, that everyone, that communities of color, that other marginalized folks especially, can tell their own stories and actually make their voices heard. So I think that's something that is always really important to come back to.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that you're probably watching this because you think these issues are important. And so, take the next step, become involved in these issues, right? Like Matt said, there's so many different avenues of people to talk to, whether it's, whoever represents you locally, or whoever represents you nationally. There's so many ways to make a positive change in these things that are really important, and it's worth the effort.
Couldn't say it better myself, so I will just say thank you to Gaurav Loya and Dana Floberg, and thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon, hopefully at freepress.net or right back here on the social medias. We're all over the internet. Contact us and help us make that change and make that difference to make this media system work better for people outside of the corporate executive suites. Thanks so much.
Thank you.